Okay, we'll get started. We have just an hour, and so people can come in, trickle in the back. Thank you all for coming to our final Emory Williams Memorial Lecture in the Liberal Arts of the semester. It's my great privilege to introduce Frank Lechner as the cleanup hitter in this semester's series. Dr. Lechner is a professor of sociology here at Emory and has published extensively on the topics of secularization and religion, globalization, sports, and American exceptionalism. Professor Lechner is a native of the Netherlands, where he earned a candidate's examen. Terrible.
That was pretty good.
At Tilburg, before coming to the United States for graduate work at Pitt, where I think he might have, and I kind of watched a YouTube lecture that he gave, I'm pretty sure he fell in love with the We Are Family Pirates of the late 70s.
1979, yes.
Yeah. He's published 4 books, one of which, on American exceptionalism, comprises 2 volumes. He's edited 3 others and published very, very many papers. Professor Lechner is an original supporter of the Voluntary core curriculum, having taught in the program since its inception nearly 15 years ago. And that's a great boon to the program because in addition to all of his scholarly productivity, Professor Lechner is a decorated teacher and has even won an Emory Williams Teaching Award, among others. Today, he'll get back to basics with a lecture on one of the key thinkers of the late 19th, early 20th centuries and founding figures in the development of the discipline of sociology, Emile Durkheim. So please join me in thanking or welcoming Professor Lechner.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. And it's a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite sociologists, Emile Durkheim. How many of you have read this book? Several colleagues, yes. They're supposed to raise their hands, yes. All right. Sociologists are not very good at creating suspense, so I'm afraid I'm going to answer the question by saying that yes, I think it is the greatest sociology book of all time. I may change my mind tomorrow, but at least for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to try to show to you that Emile Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religious Life is the greatest sociology book of all time. Of course, my point is not to establish an exact rank order, but to ask the question as a way to highlight the qualities and significance of this book. It is a recognized classic in my field. Even people who may not agree quite that it is the greatest would nonetheless recognize that it is a very great book. In fact, when this lecture was announced in my department, my colleague Ellen Eidler, sitting over there, sent me an email and said, "This was the first sociology book I read as a sophomore in college, cover to cover." And here she is, being one of the experts on religion and health. Another student, is he here? Let's see. He's here. Another student was encountered. Justin, is that you? Yes, another student encountered Emile Durkheim in my course in sociological theory, was so provoked by Durkheim's work that he decided to write an honors thesis formulating his own response to this book, which he is doing this year. So, goes to show, reading a classic is risky because it can force you to change your way of thinking and maybe even affect a whole career. All right, there's the book. Originally published in 1912. As you can see, it has a subtitle about the totemic system in Australia. At least ostensibly, this is a book trying to interpret the ceremonies, the objects, the lives of Australian Aborigines in Central Australia. You'll also notice that the critical edition of 2015 does not have a subtitle, nor do recent translations, one from 1995 and the other from 2001, recent English translations. The cover of the translation on the right-hand side there portrays modern Aboriginal art It is not actually a representation of traditional Aboriginal objects. All right. Why is this the greatest book, or why could you consider this the greatest book? In this lecture series, often, of course, lecturers talk about great works, and sometimes they leave implicit why a particular work is at least very good. And of course, it becomes obvious very often during a particular lecture, but I thought I'd make my criteria a little bit more explicit. So, number one, I want to show in a few minutes that it is a very provocative and unusually provocative, daring, almost mind-blowing work. It is a very ambitious book, one of the most ambitious books written in the history of sociology, very impactful, also very controversial. A classic, to my mind, retains its value even when it's shown to be wrong, as Durkheim certainly was in some respect. Very controversial. I'm not sure if time will allow me to get into the controversies, but that certainly is one aspect of the reception of his book. And finally, I want to stress the significance of this book, not just as an academic piece of work for academics, but really, to my mind, it has broader social significance as well. Before I say more about the book, let me say a few words about the author, Emile Durkheim. Born David Emile Durkheim in Épinal in eastern France. The name David was dropped. He was the son of a rabbi, growing up in an Orthodox Jewish family. He selected his middle name, Emile, as a professional name as he left his faith, as he left his community of origin. So Emile Durkheim himself went through a process of secularization reflected in his name. Even the pronunciation is a little bit tricky because I'm going to anglicize it for our purposes as Durkheim, but I think his original version was something like Durkheim to play down the Germanic connotations of his name, because eastern France, Épinal there in Lorraine, was contested territory, contested between Germany and France for a long time. So Durkheim wanted to present himself as a proper, secular, republican French patriot, and he thought of his sociology as a contribution to that republican project. He went to one of the top academic institutions in Paris, École Normale Supérieure. He was a philosophy graduate. Sociology as a discipline did not exist when he attended, and he, in a sense, was a critical figure in the creation of the discipline in France, but really worldwide. He taught in Bordeaux, as you know, southwestern part, and then ended his career in Paris, really at the pinnacle of the French academic system. He was also the leader of a research team, a whole journal, the Année Sociologique, and really tried to get sociology off the ground in France. That really was his life's work. He was the first professor of sociology, that is the first chair with sociology in the title in 1913. Prior to that, he had been a professor of education and pedagogy, focusing on the teaching of teachers. He was very involved in the building of the secular educational system that was supposed to bolster the French Republic as it went through major changes. So he was a supporter of the Third Republic, as that political system was called, and he became, as Robert Bellah said, a theologian of its civil religion, that is, articulating the values that he thought that Third Republic should represent. That actually is part of the agenda behind the book I'll be talking about in a minute. He was a founder of a school in sociology. Certainly he had rivals even in France itself. The school itself is somewhat controversial. I put the term founder in quotes because it may be somewhat politically incorrect these days to talk about the founders of the field, but nonetheless he is a major figure in sociology. On the right-hand side you see him teaching there at the Sorbonne. You'll notice that there are women in the audience, very progressive for 1911. And there he is, more towards the bottom, having an incredibly good time on the beach in his three-piece suit and his hat. That's about the extent of the pleasure that he allowed himself. He was an incredible workaholic. On the right-hand side, you can't quite see it, is young man in uniform, his son André, picture was taken in 1915, who shortly after went to the front and was killed fighting in World War I. You'll see there also, I've got some props, let's see. great biography of Emile Durkheim. Only 900 pages. No, I think the English version is slightly abridged, maybe 800. But fantastic book, reads like a novel. And of course, these people, this was pre-internet, I realize, they wrote letters. So we have a lot of letters from Emile Durkheim and some sent to him. Unfortunately, some of his records were destroyed when the Nazis took over in France. But nonetheless, the record is very good. And so the irony is that I sometimes have a feeling that I know Emile Durkheim better than I know some of my colleagues at Emory University. So it's interesting. Here are his major books. He published 4 major books in his lifetime. The Elementary Forms of Religious Life was the 4th major book, published in 1912, as I said. The 3 others, Division of Labor and Society, Rules of Sociological Methods, Suicide, all classics in the field. Any self-respecting sociologist should at least read these books once in their lives. Also later published Moral Education, one of his central interests. So the elementary forms came at the end of his career, and in a sense answered questions that had come up previously. This picture is a little bit misleading because there's a book missing. That is, the Elementary Forms of Religious Life was supposed to have a compendium volume on morality, which Durkheim didn't get to finish because he died in 1917. Book on morality that I think is kind of the practical complement to the theoretical case that he is making in the Elementary Forms of Religious Life. All right, Durkheim's questions. You don't have to internalize all these questions. I simply want to point out that he had a very ambitious agenda to begin with in this book. He was struggling with the intellectual problem, what is the role of religion in society? Really, since the 1890s, he had been grappling with that. He was delving into an anthropological debate about the meaning of new findings in North America, in Australia, what was really going on, and what is totemism, one of the key questions. Philosophical problem. How can we account for knowledge? Durkheim, as I said, was trained as a philosopher. He thought that philosophers had not quite come to grips with the conditions of valid knowledge. He thought that sociology might be able to provide answers to these philosophical questions. Socio-political problem, perhaps the most important one. That is, he perceived that the society around him was divided, was going through very difficult times, and he wanted to help provide answers, and he thought sociology could do that. I call that the Durkheim predicament, the sense that society was in conflict, in tension, and that there should be a way out. And I'm going to suggest that part of the significance of this book is that I think we're still grappling with the Durkheim predicament, or grappling with it once again in American society, many other countries today. And I think Durkheim's answer to that predicament is still relevant, still a way that he speaks to us today. And finally, the academic problem. How best to demonstrate the value of sociology, which he does in this book by saying that, in effect, sociology can explain everything. All right, this is a very provocative book. Probably a book for atheists. I'm just going to give you some quotes from this book. Provocative for atheists because Durkheim says in the beginning, there are no false religions. All are true in their fashion. So is he really saying that even religions that might contradict each other in some way, all are nonetheless true? For believers, it's a provocative book. The totem is at once the symbol of the God and of society. Is it not the case that the God and the society are one and the same? So you're saying that God and society are the same thing, identical, equivalent? If religion generated everything that is essential in society, this is because the idea of society is the soul of religion. Wait, I thought the soul of religion had to do with believing God or Buddha or something like society. This reality, which is the objective, universal, and eternal cause of those sui generis sensations that make up the religious experience, is Durkheim's favorite word?
Society.
Thank you very much. They are taking my class on sociological theory right now. Durkheim is an intellectual hedgehog. Isaiah Berlin has this metaphor of intellectual foxes and hedgehogs. A fox knows many things derived from a Greek fable. Fox knows many things, hedgehog knows a single big thing. Durkheim is the quintessential sociological hedgehog. All of his ideas revolved around the idea, the concept, the importance, the value of
Society.
Indeed. This presentation risks becoming a little bit repetitive, but don't blame me, blame Durkheim. All right, provocative book for philosophers. The fundamental categories of thought and consequently of science have religious origins. So wait, so are you saying that science, let's say next door in the science building, that what they're doing there, the categories that they apply there are of religious origins? Would my colleagues in physics and chemistry agree with that? I'm going to skip the next one. Philosophers, scientists, scientific thought is merely a more perfect form of religious thought. Are we really saying that science is in a sense piggybacking on religion? This faith in science is not essentially different from religious faith. Everything in social life, even science itself, has some opinion. So the conditions, say the plausibility of what we're doing here at Emory, has a kind of religious quality. Is he really saying that? For modern scholars it's provocative because he is saying that the one well-made experiment, that is the focus on Australian Aborigines, can in effect tell us all we need to know about religion in general. It's the simplest available case that can tell us the truth of what is going on there. Sociology seems called upon to open a new way to the science of man. L'homme, that sounds more neutral in French. As soon as we recognize that above the individual there is society, and that society is a system of active forces, a new way of explaining man becomes possible. So this is an instance of sociological imperialism. That once you have the proper sociological grasp of something, we can explain lots of things. And we don't really need political science, economics. The laughter came from my colleagues in sociology, I realize. Yeah, so as you can tell, we still have these departments. Not everybody agreed with Emile Durkheim that sociology quite was entitled to this broad agenda, but this was his key aspiration. Sociology, properly conceived, could in a sense be the encompassing social science, and that is what he was going to demonstrate in this book. So it is an ambitious book about totemism, although you'll see in my presentation that the realities of Australian life sort of disappear a little bit because Durkheim had a kind of theoretical axe to grind. Totemism is taken as an elementary form, the elementary form of religious life, perhaps better understood as elemental in the sense of essential, not just simple but essential. Studying that elemental form of religious life also shows us the origins of categories of knowledge, which thereby demonstrates the special power and meaning of society, and therefore also has something to say about modern society. That is sometimes missed, but on the very first page, Durkheim says that this book is also written to make sense, written for a modern audience, to make sense of modern circumstances. And I think that he was right in his day, and I think this still applies now as well. So this is the map that came with the original book, and he is mainly talking about the Arunta, or what was then called the Arunta tribe in right near Alice Springs in Central Australia, and a few of the others as well. Very simply put, these are images from one of his main sources. Very simply put, what Durkheim is doing, at least anthropologically in this book, is to suggest that ceremonies like the ones on the left, corroborees, that is festive or sacred gatherings, have certain intrinsic qualities that account for the special respect for images and objects on the right. Like the churinga on the top right-hand corner that is carved pieces of wood or rock that in this case represents the tracks of the ancestors, totemic images of, on the right-hand side, simply painted images representing a totem that is a totemic animal. Same thing here in Tichuma. A ritual that is associated with increasing the supply of plants or animals for nutrition. On the right-hand side, a frog churinga that is also a totem, one of the totems of one of the clans within the tribe of the Arunta. So Durkheim's basic idea is that each clan, that is each small subgroup within a tribe, has its own particular practices that are associated with particular sacred objects onto which they project the energy of the collectivity. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Okay, so the connection between the images and the object is in effect part of his argument. Here's what he was using in his book. He was drawing on the work of Robertson Smith, British historian of religions, who already had a kind of sociological view of sacrifice and communion, saying that when people celebrate, for example, by slaughtering an animal and then partaking of it, they are in effect celebrating not simply a god, but also celebrating their own sense of community. So Durkheim, in fact, got one of his basic ideas to some extent from Robertson Smith. He was arguing with Mr. Fraser, at the time a major anthropologist in Britain, but his major source was two books by Spencer and Gillen, Baldwin Spencer, anthropologist, Gillen, administrator in Australia, who had done extensive field work on Australian Aborigines. These books are still worth reading, even though they are regarded as somewhat unreliable, because Spencer and Gillen hung out with Aboriginal groups for a long period of time and gave very detailed descriptions. I added up the references, the number of references to these books. There are 214 references to this book. So, to these two books. So, message to undergraduates here. Do not do that in your term papers, right? That's too much. That's overkill. Your professors might suspect that you're copying, etc., etc. You get my point. There is actually an issue with all these citations. I'll get to that later. So this is, you might say, the evidence that Durkheim was using to interpret what was going on in Australia. It was, of course, a work in the sociology of religion. And there's a whole bunch of scholarship that follows in his footsteps. I'll say more about what his argument was about religion in a minute. It is also something emphasized in recent literature, an exercise in the sociology of knowledge or epistemology. That is, how do we actually know things? Sir Durkheim argued that if we understand the activities in society properly, we also understand the methods that we have to make sense of the world around us. Society gives us the answers, so to speak. And this whole book is a vindication, you see how it's getting repetitive, a vindication of society. Here's one of Durkheim's quotes, a very Durkheimian quote. For society, indeed, wields a creative power that no observable being can equal. A society is the most powerful bundle of physical and moral forces observable in nature. So there's a lot of this kind of celebration of society in this book. There's a comment by an aspiring poet, T.S. Eliot, who commented on who read Durkheim's work, wrote a review of it, and then also commented on a polemic against Durkheim, from which I took this quote. T.S. Eliot, apart from Old Possum's book of Practical Cats, was not known for his sense of humor, but this line is actually, I think, pretty funny. Mr. Durkheim talks far too much about society, which is funny because, of course, that is really all he talks about all the time. Everything is ascribed to its influence. Morris Ginsburg, he says, in general, La Société had an intoxicating effect on his mind. So what makes this book mind-blowing is that this is really a record of that intoxication. There is no other book in sociology that, in a sense, articulates the meaning of society so profoundly as this book. Right or wrong, that is as a reading experience, if nothing else, that is a very powerful thing. It is also part of what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas called the discourse of modernity. That is, there's a whole bunch of books, some of the great works of the kind that are covered in the voluntary core curriculum, that are part of the self-reflection of intellectuals in modern societies. Where is modern society going? What are its basic problems? What can we do about it? So some of the great works in courses of this sort are part of this discourse of modernity. I'm arguing here that Durkheim contributed to that discourse and that this book is part of that as well. On the right-hand side, you see two recently published books, one by James Davison Hunter, one by French sociologist Olivier Roy, and they have a very Durkheimian cast to them. That is, one says that, as you can tell by the cover, solidarity in modern society, America is gone, right? We're completely at a loss. The other, perhaps even more pessimistic, Olivier Roy, saying we don't even have a sense of what it means to have a common culture. So that is what I call the Durkheim predicament. I'm suggesting that Durkheim's reflections on that predicament are still quite relevant to us today. He presents what I call a secular salvation story. That is, he says things that make it appear or give us hope, perhaps, that society itself can regenerate a sense of direction. No society can exist that does not feel the need at regular intervals to sustain and reaffirm the collective feelings and ideas that constitute its unity and personality. The ancient gods grow old or die and others are not yet born. The second point was a very common sentiment at the turn of the century, a little over 100 years ago, that the great values, certainly Christianity, Catholicism in France was no longer what it used to be. There was no clear sense of an alternative ideology. This was Durkheim's way of expressing that kind of cultural confusion. But he argued that state of confusion could not remain, and he ultimately thought that this particular book could provide some of the answers. So what Durkheim offers, what is distinctive about this book, I think, is that he offers a modern solution to a modern predicament. In other words, sociology, as the quintessential modern social science, was the method by which modern society could, in a way, pull itself up by its bootstraps and get a new sense of meaning and direction. And he explicitly formulated that position against radicals on the left, who wanted to overthrow the whole system, and conservatives on the right, who just wanted to turn back the clock. He was trying to thread the needle, as it were, for a kind of liberal, progressive position, and this book helps him do it. It is the theoretical foundation for a later, more practical demonstration. So you see how this is an incredibly ambitious book as well. So it's a significant book because it's more than sociology, it's a celebration of society, and it is really more than sociology per se, because it speaks to these larger issues and it provides what I call a secular salvation story as well. All right. If you don't mind, I'm not going to walk you through the whole book because it's pretty long. So I'm just going to give you a few snippets from different sections outlined here. If you want to know more, there's plenty to read, as you can see. This is the table of contents. So a whole bunch of stuff I am not going to cover. All right, introduction. The general conclusion of the book you're about to read is that religion is something eminently social. Religious representations are collective representations that express collective realities. So right up front, Durkheim posits his main thesis about the collective reality of religion. When primitive beliefs are systematically analyzed, as basic categories are encountered in the process, they are born in and of religion. They are the products of collective thought. He's thinking about categories like time and space and kind, essentially arguing that it's the temporal rhythms of social life that give us a sense of how time works, what time really is. So in both cases, of course, he is arguing against more individualistic theories, the idea that religion is first and foremost a matter of individual faith, or that knowledge is first and foremost something that is the product of individual reason. Durkheim is moving away from those individualistic arguments to a more collective approach. Okay, so that is he lays out his theses in the introduction. Then a little bit later, he defines religion. This is a tricky definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and surrounded by prohibitions. Beliefs and practices that unite its adherents in a single moral community called a church. Why tricky? Why is this a tricky definition? Does this strike you as a reasonable definition of religion? Pardon me?
She was nodding yes.
She was nodding yes. Well, some people would have issues with this definition because there's a whole bunch. Pardon me?
Very Western definition.
It's what?
It's a very Western European.
Western, for example, yes. But maybe even worse. There's a lot of stuff packed into this definition that you say, well, it's not a very clean definition, shall we say, right? So, a unified system of beliefs and practices. Well, okay, so are we saying that religion can only be a religion if it's unified? relative to sacred things. This was Durkheim's main point, in a way, that religion is all about these special symbols and practices that are indeed set apart. That there is a distinction between sacred and profane, and that is what marks religion. Beliefs and practices that unite its adherents. So there's already built into the definition what you might call a functional argument, that if you have a religion, it is going to unify the group. A moral community that you can call a church. So even the language there, Durkheim means this term church in a very generic sense, but nonetheless you can say that the language itself has this kind of Western connotation as well. So what's tricky about it is that this is not sort of a simple definition to get the argument started, but the definition itself already contains a lot of the substantive claims that he wants to make. All right, perhaps the central chapter. The origins of beliefs. Durkheim has argued that there are these sacred objects, these wood blocks and these rocks that are surrounded by these special ceremonies, and what is really going on there. And so what he is saying is that these emblems, these totemic images, are in a sense the representation of the group. They stand for the group as a whole. How could the group's emblem become the face of this quasi-divinity in the group and the divinity if the group and the divinity were two distinct realities? Okay, so typical Durkheimian argument. The god of the clan, the totemic principle, must therefore be the clan itself, but transfigured and imagined in the physical form of the plant or animal species that serve as totems. If they both have these same qualities, well, then they must be the same. So that is the first step. Second point he makes is that, well, these sacred objects seem to have all these special qualities. When people are in the presence of these totems, they feel it has a special power over them, that it is different from anything else, that it has a certain kind of authority, that it is more than they can do for themselves. What else is there in human experience that has these same features? Let's see. It must be society. Generally speaking, a society is quite capable of arousing the sensation of the divine simply by its influence over the minds of its members. To them, it is like a god to the faithful. And then perhaps the most famous part of this chapter and perhaps this book is Durkheim's elaboration of Aboriginal rituals, where he says, in the corroboree, other kinds of rituals, he says these gatherings of Aboriginal groups create a kind of special electricity. People feel like they're caught up in this social process. When a corroboree takes place, everything changes. The very fact of assembling is an exceptionally powerful stimulant. Their proximity generates a kind of electricity. It is in these sociologists' favorite word, effervescent social settings, and from this very effervescence that the religious idea seems to be born. Because this powerful experience, Durkheim argues, is represented by these, in the form of these powerful objects that then, in a sense, work back on the collectivity and give it a sense of unity and coherence as well. Because religious force is nothing but, sociological imperialism again, right? So religious force is nothing but the collective and anonymous force of the clan, and because this can be imagined only in the form of the totem, the totemic emblem is like the visible body of the god. So you see, this is about as far as you can go with a sociological argument to, in a sense, deconstruct religion and religious faith by relating it to basic social practices. Right? When people first read that in 1912, 1913, that was a mind-blowing experience for people used to more traditional religious thinking. Very briefly, don't read all this. The main point of this slide is to allude to Durkheim's philosophical ambition to show that some features of these rituals have qualities that inspire in people a sense of these basic categories. For example, the concept of causality. How is it that we can think causally about things that happen in reality? Well, Durkheim says it doesn't come out of our individual minds. It comes out of the experience of a ritual having certain basic effects on our minds, or the mindset that we share. So, for example, he talks about mimetic rituals where people imitate certain animals by shrieking in a particular way, for example. And he says the moral efficacy of that rite creates the belief in its physical efficacy, which is imaginary, and he is in a sense saying that the general concepts that we use in many settings derive from that basic experience. And then the conclusion is one of the most amazing pieces of writing in sociology, because you get a sense of an almost mystical identification of the author and his subject. He is in a sense thinking his way into society and its power and its meaning so intensely that you say, you're almost concerned about his state of mind. Okay, so he sort of pushes his sociological line to the extreme. But he's also arguing that, as he says, as a boldface there, a society can neither create itself nor recreate itself without at the same time creating the ideal. And of course that is part of his modern message as well. That modern societies in a sense have lost the capacity for that kind of regeneration. No society can exist that does not feel the need at regular intervals to sustain and affirm the collective feelings and ideas that constitute its unity. Society alone can provide us with the most general notions according to which it must be represented. You get the drift of his celebration of society there, and that is how this book concludes. Now, very briefly, I hope you get a sense that this is a pretty radical and pretty provocative and pretty ambitious book. It is also very impactful, so don't just take my word for it that it is a great book. A lot of other people have said so. 74 early reviews. French scholars have compiled the numbers. There are not many books. This was just in the years after its initial publication. Not many books that get 74 reviews, including by very famous people, Times Literary Supplement, all the great anthropologists. Everybody wrote about this book. That already tells you that it really, it made a splash. It made a splash from 1912 to 1917. Everybody felt that they had to respond, not just because it was an academic book, but because it spoke to these larger issues as well. You see the waves in the receptions, a whole list of venues where reviews were published. Very few books today get, what was it? 74 reviews. Half a dozen would be pretty good. Times Literary Supplement, special. Another mark of its greatness is that critics, people who were very critical of the book, nonetheless all said, well, this is a fantastically great book and everybody should read it. So Bronislaw Malinowski, famous anthropologist, says, while one is bound to criticize Mr. Durkheim, this is a performance that can only be given by one of the acutest and most brilliant living sociologists, and these by themselves would make the book a contribution to science of the greatest importance. Stephen Lukes, fantastic secondary source, one of the best books ever written about a sociologist. Despite the many criticisms that have been justifiably advanced in brains, a major and profound contribution to the sociology of religion, more generally to the sociology of ideas and ideologies. So when very sharp critics nonetheless praise a book like this, you get a sense that it's pretty great. There are 56 editions in 23 countries, so this book had a global reach. 3 translations. Itself unusual, right? Pretty big book. Translation 1915, 1995, 2001. Indulge me for 2 minutes in a very brief expression of my irritation at these translations. Of course, it's important to know, people in the humanities will not be surprised that many great books, of course, come to us in translation. And very often there are issues with those translations. So if you just, so this is the 1995 one by Karen Fields, and that's the 2001 version. So right away, you don't have to know any French to realize that there are some significant differences. The middle one is different because pardon me? What's different? I saw a hand up. Yes?
The middle one uses I, the second one uses we.
Very good. I'll come back to that. Let me just, very good to pick up. In fact, the first 2 words of the original are nous. Nous nous proposons d'étudier. This is just a stylistic convention. We propose as a reflexive verb. Nu, we, is Durkheim's second favorite word. So it's very striking that he uses that word twice to begin the book. So it's a very good pickup. In fact, Fournier, in his biography, quotes a letter by Durkheim saying, "Il y a un plaisir à dire nous." That is, there's a special pleasure in saying we. Durkheim was all about we, the we-ness of society. So that is very significant. So Karen Fields, updating Durkheim, switches from we to I. Completely changes the tone. Excellent. But you see that the introduction has a subheading, Objet de la recherche and Sociologie religieuse, théorie de la connaissance, missing from introduction, right? So why drop it? Subject of study, sociology of religion and theories of knowledge. Well, that's not what Durkheim says. He says religious sociology and théorie, singular, de la connaissance. So you don't have to know any French to say that even this slightly better translation does things differently. Durkheim is not, he could have said sociology of religion, but he says religious sociology, partly because he is trying to give a different account of society by means of the study of religion. He's not just studying religion from the point of view of sociology. And his goal is to provide a theory, singular, a single correct theory, not theories. No, he thought he had the right theory. Simple stuff. But right away, an English reader, I think, gets the wrong impression from these translations. All right, thank you for indulging me. If we have time, I have a whole nother slide on issues in translation. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that too. When people recognize the centennial of this book, many books published. L'année sociologique was the journal founded by Durkheim. It was refounded later. Of course, celebrated the anniversary of this book. Significant point for sociologists, a number of very major figures in my field think that the elementary forms of religious life is the primary programmatic statement for modern sociology. So on the left-hand side, some quotes by Jeffrey Alexander, recently retired from Yale. Durkheim's later work contains a program which must be revived in a fragmentary way. It has been at the heart of cultural analysis all along. In a more explicit form, it can revitalize the practice of sociology today. Randall Collins on the right-hand side, saying that Durkheim provided sociologists with a mechanism for situational interaction that is that is still the most useful we have. He set this model up in the case of religious ritual in a way that enables us to see what social ingredients come together in a situation that makes a ritual succeed or fail. All right. I'm going to skip that. I'm not going to go into detail on the next two slides, simply but I want to point out that this is a controversial classic. That is, people have leveled very serious criticism at this book, both in terms of the structure of the argument. Durkheim makes lots of assumptions that he doesn't quite sustain, and in terms of the evidence. Again, something that undergraduates here may not want to copy. Don't do what Durkheim did, because if you look at these 214 references, which I don't recommend, I didn't do it myself, but Watts Miller did it. And when you look at these references, you see that Durkheim makes these very bold claims. Reference Spencer and Gillen. You look at what Spencer and Gillen said, and it's something completely different. So there are many instances of that. So Watts Miller concludes that Durkheim's account of Australia is neither an accurate representation nor a hopeless falsification of what is overwhelmingly its main ethnographic source. It is an imaginative theoretical reconstruction, perhaps best described as a transfiguration of Spencer and Gillen's Australia. All right. I want to conclude for the sake of time, it is a significant book. I already mentioned that to my mind it is more than a sociology of religion, more than a sociology of knowledge. It is the quintessential sociology book because it probes the meaning and reality of society more profoundly than any other. It is also more than sociology, as I mentioned, because it is speaking to broader societal issues. How do we construct common values? What does it mean to recreate solidarity in society? Is it even possible to recreate a kind of sacred canopy under which we can all live a meaningful life? Durkheim thought that was possible. And Durkheim takes a distinctive position in major debates. So, for example, he says that people at the time were arguing, and people are still arguing today, well, religion is declining, everything is becoming secular. Or conservatives were arguing at the time, religion is indispensable, we have to get back to it. Or more sort of liberal thinkers, we have to find a functional alternative. Maybe human rights can be an alternative kind of religion. So there were these different camps. So Durkheim, on this issue and many others, is in a sense trying to integrate these different camps into one framework, one perspective. And that is partly why this book resonated so much, because people had this feeling that this guy had figured it out, right? That he had constructed a kind of synthesis, possibly, that could provide solutions, not just academic, but also social. I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. I can say more about that later. So Mark Cladis also comments on this sense of religion having been a big deal in the past, being able to be brought back. How can we do it? Conclusion. The greatest? Yeah, I think it is the greatest. Partly, I didn't really touch on what's the competition. What other books are greater in sociology? Perhaps the competition in my field is not quite as stiff as it might be in other fields. But I hope I've made a case that this is a pretty great book in terms of its provocative and ambitious substance. It still speaks to us. People are, not just academics, but many other people are responding to Durkheim's very bold arguments. He is not just an academic, he is also speaking to social issues. It is a heroic effort. It is as far as you can go in showing that society shapes what we value, society shapes what we know, society shapes really the meaning of our lives. That is the central message that Durkheim conveyed. It was also a heroic effort to think sociologically about these issues as a basis for social reform. I myself believe that ultimately Durkheim failed in that regard. In other words, yes, it was a heroic effort, but the record of France itself shows that France remained a fundamentally divided society. Perhaps people weren't listening closely enough to Durkheim. Perhaps people are not listening to sociologists generally closely enough. He made a heroic effort, but the effort certainly did not pay off in the way that he expected. So I would say that having read this book, the Durkheimian predicament, not just the academic, but the societal predicament remains. It remained for him and it remains for us today. But having said that, I do think that in spite of what you might consider Durkheim's socio-political failure, he nonetheless has provided us with the tools to think very seriously about the nature of that predicament. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
In all the many ways that society has changed since he wrote this book, how do you think that he would think about religion today? Do you think he would give a different definition or
Number one, he would stick to his guns. That is, Durkheim thought he had the answers, and he was aware of many of these criticisms leveled at his book right after it came out. He was engaged in many debates, and he didn't give an inch. So what would Durkheim say? Pretty much the same thing that he would have said then. However, I think you're quite right to point out that some of the issues that he was grappling with are still with us today, I would say, in a more intensified form. That is, if you think about secularization, certainly in France, in the United States, going through a secularizing process, that in a way the predicament is more striking. That is the question for how can a society like the United States, say, achieve a sense of solidarity that encompasses the population, is almost a bigger issue than the issue that France grappled with a century ago. And what the solution even would look like, I think, is difficult to say. So Durkheim, intellectually, I think he would stick to his guns, but I think he would recognize that many societies, France included, France just had an election, a threefold difference, split in French society. How are these different ends of the political spectrum in France? How are they going to get along, right? It's very difficult to say. So I think he would be very disappointed in a way that his kind of progressive reworking of these issues, what he really wanted to do, was not working. That his rethinking of essentially the legacy of the French Revolution did not take hold the way he had hoped. Okay, so intellectually he would do the same thing, but I think he would be struck and perhaps very disappointed that here we are 100 years later and still fighting in the same way and still grappling with the same issues and not really finding a clear way out. Yes, yes.
Does Durkheim mention how religion societally reinforcing dynamics might change, whether it's monotheistic or polytheistic?
Yes and no. I mean, he doesn't talk a lot about variation in religious practice along those lines. He has a more evolutionary, simple to complex kind of argument. But his basic point in sociology of religion, sociology of knowledge, is that if you know the basic structure of society, how society is organized in a basic way. So, for example, is it clan-based, yes or no, as with the Australians? Then you can make some predictions about what kinds of beliefs people will hold, what kinds of beliefs might be plausible, yes or no. So he might say that in a more centrally organized, to give a very simple example, oversimplified, in a more centralized society, it makes more sense to think of a single great divine power that represents the society as a whole. Whereas a society that is more differentiated and more dispersed might have different kinds of faith and different kinds of rituals. Yes?
I was wondering how Durkheim would respond to examples like secularization in France, when in some cases secularization seems to isolate communities rather than kind of promote a togetherness.
Yes. So Durkheim's clever argument was to have his cake and eat it and have the frosting as well. In other words, do everything at the same time. So he would argue that yes, there can be secularization in the sense that traditional religion declines, but if society does its job properly, we can regenerate something new, right? A kind of secular faith of the sort that he argues. So strictly speaking, he would not want to recognize the idea that there is a truly secular society. Every society, he argues, has religious qualities. It is just a matter of reviving them. Right? So that is how he can have his cake and wants to have his cake and eat it too. Having said that, I myself believe, and I think this is what you were implying with your question, that of course, once traditional religious frameworks decline, it becomes more difficult than Durkheim realizes to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? And that is one of the factors that the United States I believe, is grappling with today. That a religious tradition that used to inform social and political activity, or at least legitimate it at a sort of general level, cannot be taken for granted anymore. For example, right? So that's one area where I myself am a little bit skeptical about Durkheim. That secularization is a deeper process and more profoundly disruptive process than Durkheim wanted to recognize, and that applies to France as well. Yes.
How did Durkheim relate religion to individual experiences, and more specifically, like the liminality of rituals and how they can separate individuals from society as they transform from one status, like status A to status B, within these rituals?
Yes. Well, how much time do you have? So your question is very well taken, in the sense that, from a non-Durkheimian point of view, you say, well, religious believers actually, personally, individually, believe something. And when they participate in rituals, it actually, personally, individually, has an effect on them as participants. So that I think is very sensible. So Durkheim, in his book, certainly has many chapters where he has done his heavy-duty sociological argument, and he says, well, but this spirit of the group trickles down into the spirit of the participants, because they, after all, they are part of that ritual and they sustain it as well. And then he has a crafty argument about what you might call the internalization of these collective experiences. But this internalization is strictly guided, you might say, by society itself. So the liminality, which is a good term to use here, that is, his account of these rituals is indeed that it is a kind of liminal experience, right? People move from the profane into the sacred realm, and that transforms what they're doing, that transforms the way they're thinking about themselves under the powerful influence of society. So there's a kind of, you might say, there's a little bit of a trickle-down theory there. Whether that's totally convincing, you'd have to read the book. Yes.
I was wondering if in the Durkheimian school of thought there is room for other explanations of the existence of religion beyond something that acts as
Mm-hmm.
something that provides moral solidarity. For instance, is there room for ideas about religion arising as a consequence of existential, inherently existential questions that, people have just as a consequence of being animals with, very highly developed brains, things like that?
No, sorry.
Okay.
No, but of course it's a perfectly fair question. And that is what makes this a radical, mind-blowing book, because some of the questions, I think, are partly informed by different views of religion, and which also existed, of course, at the time. So when people had these more individualistic, more traditional religious views, etc., when they read this book, they said, dare I say, oh my God, what's going on in this? What's going on in this text? So very strict. So Durkheim did think, of course, that once you truly grasp his argument, that gives an answer to existential questions. That was at least his hope. But I gather from your reaction to my talk that you're not totally convinced that he has all the answers.
No, I thought it was very, very moving and
Okay. I'll give Durkheim the credit, yes. Very, very good. Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm curious, as societies change, what become the new totems? And what might be
Yes.
examples of totems in a modern society that's more secularized, more based on more abstract things like human rights?
Yes. So Durkheim struggled with that because on the one hand, he was of course very eager to provide guidance of that sort, to identify what these new totems could be. And in a way he did it through this practice of teaching, the teaching of teachers. That is, he instructed high school teachers primarily. The Third Republic was establishing this new educational system to inspire them to provide a kind of sense of civic duty on the part of at least educated Frenchmen. So you could say that was a way of connecting individual citizens to the larger republic. But he also said that you couldn't really, as I think I quoted, you couldn't really predict what the new gods, small g gods, were going to be. And he himself certainly was a liberal, Republican, progressive figure who wanted to revive the French revolutionary tradition, but do it more sensibly, so to speak. So human rights, the idea of the individual, the value of the individual as such, which of course sounds abstract. It's not really a totem in a traditional sense. But that's where he was. So he wanted to support that for sure, partly as an emancipated Jew, thinking about rising anti-Semitism. So he articulated himself the cult of the individual, as he called it, but it was fairly abstract, and he was aware. So one of the odd things about this book, or maybe not odd, but distinctive things, is that he gives you the strong impression that these Australian Aborigines have their act together better than modern Frenchmen at the time. They led a meaningful, coherent life, unlike these supposedly modern, progressive Frenchmen. Right? So yes, he wanted to find a way out, but he had a little trouble actually showing concretely how it could be done. And he had a sociological argument because ultimately it's not up to him as an individual, but it's up to society to create the mechanisms for its own regeneration. So, yeah. All right.
The Durkheim that you described seems like a lot like thinkers in the late 19th century and 20th century in Europe and North America, who deployed a kind of misunderstanding of Darwin and
Yes.
described history as if it were a movement from the
Yes.
primitive to the developed.
Yes.
Now that we know that that's a fallacy, is Durkheim's book really still so great? If it's predicated on the notion that a supposedly sophisticated European can go to Australia and look at a supposedly elemental or elemental form of life,
Yes.
and then infer from that and understand how he has developed from that stage.
Yes.
I think someone like Malinowski himself, shortly after Durkheim,
Yes.
went beyond that kind of thinking, but it was very popular, even in someone
Correct.
like Freud, in psychology, ethnology, anthropology.
Correct.
Fraser's whole work is predicated on the idea
Yes.
of a misunderstanding of Darwin. So am I wrong to think, after listening to your talk, that Durkheim was one of those? And if it is true of him, if he is subject to this fallacy, I mean, we know after 1945 that the supposedly complex civilizations of Europe are actually more barbarous than supposedly primitive countries. Is it still worth reading Durkheim? Because I have that book that you had on the screen, I just haven't got around to reading it. But should I?
Yes. Yes, you should. Number one, I agree with your basic point that Durkheim is beholden to a 19th century tradition. That his basic argument depends on this notion that you can look at the simplest available case, infer universal features of religion that then evolved by a certain kind of historical process to climax perhaps in the more sophisticated, complex religions of the 20th century. So indeed, that was part of his argument. But I don't think that his being embedded in this, shall we say, semi-misreading of Darwin, it invalidates everything he said, because in a way his argument is better than the logic of this method. That is, he has things to say about what the Australians were doing that may not in a sense do justice even to what they really were doing. I left aside entire controversies about whether Durkheim really understood what the Aboriginals thought they themselves were doing. But in almost it was a creative transfiguration. And that because it is a creative transfiguration, it in a sense ends up being better than the crummy evolutionary method, and better also, I think, more worth reading than the somewhat unreliable and somewhat misleading anthropological reports of the time. Okay, so the very fact that he deviated a bit from the scholarly consensus at the time makes him more interesting to read now, I think.
Okay. Let's thank Professor Lechner.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.